Louis Kahn was educated at the University of Pennsylvania between 1920 and 1924 in what's called the Beaux-Arts tradition. So let's see what that is and how later we'll be able to talk about how it influenced his approach to architecture. Anybody know what Beaux-Arts means? Right, but what does the word mean? So beautiful arts, but what's the word we use here? Fine arts. So it means art, well, painting, sculpture, the fine arts. Okay, so Louis Kahn was educated in the Beaux-Arts tradition. So he was educated at the University of Pennsylvania, but let's see what the Beaux-Arts tradition was. So, okay, the École des Beaux-Arts, a school of architecture, painting, and sculpture in Paris. These are several meanings of the word. We say that's a Beaux-Arts building. Then we mean a style of architecture associated with this education. If we say Beaux-Arts approach to architecture, we mean an education in the United States modeled in some ways on this French school. So we can have three meanings. We can mean the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, we can mean a Beaux-Arts education, which Kahn had at Penn, and we can say the 42nd Street Library is a Beaux-Arts building. And that means it's got formal planning, symmetry, a strong partie, etc., the characteristics of Beaux-Arts architecture. What we're going to see is the leading architects of the early 20th century had a Beaux-Arts education, and then how did they convert those that did to modernism? And that's what Kahn does. So how did this education work? And it was a little bit different from ours. So like Pratt, the École des Beaux-Arts would have courses in structures and materials and stuff like that, but no design studios. The design studios were private, like down the street. And a patron, or patron, would have an atelier or studio. And when you arrive to go to the school, you would choose a studio, a patron. Unlike Pratt, you would stay in that studio your whole time. You don't change every semester. You then register as an aspirant, aspiring to enroll, and take exams. When you've passed the entrance exams, you're in. Some people might have had a strong background, maybe their parents were architects. Come day one, take the exam, they're in. Some people spend a year or two sitting in on classes and studying up for the exams. Now they're in, and they're second class. And they take courses, and they enter competitions. And then they become first class, enter more competitions, and then they do the Grand Prix de Rome, which is like the degree project. Now, competitions worked as follows. Okay, next week they're going to have a competition. It's going to be for a library. That's all you know. So you study up on libraries. You go to the school. You bring your drawing boards. And you go into an 8 by 8 foot room, and they lock the door. You stay there for 8 hours. Can't go in or out. And while you're there, you now design the building in 8 hours. When I was a student, we did that called a sketch problem. Okay, we're going to whip out a building this afternoon. And you had to make 2 sets of drawings. One you turned in, and the other you took back to the studio. And now your head of the studio says, oh shit, I don't know what we're going to do with this. Let's see what we can do. If you really screwed up, look, there's another competition in 2 weeks. Don't waste your time. If we can do something with this, great. Let's get to work. And you have 6 weeks to develop it up, to develop the design and do the drawings. The drawings are due midnight on Thursday. there's no such thing as late. So it's 11:30 and a charrette shows up. You might have heard the term, you're on charrette, which is a little cart. You put your drawings in it and you run alongside of it, still filling in trees. Just like a Pratt student working on the subway on their laptop. And you then turn it in, and then next week they put them up, and all these old farts come and grade your project. You're not there. You're not there to say, you enter here. If it's not clear where you enter, you fail. Well, you're going to be standing in front of your building for the next 100 years telling people where the entrance is? It's, you know, if it's not in the drawing, it's not going to get built. So there's nothing to explain. They don't care about your design methodology. They're looking at your building. Now, here's the hard part. Let's say this is Calatrava, and this is Frank Gehry. You have to choose one or the other when you come to register. Let's say Calatrava is in and Frank Gehry is out. You believe in Frank Gehry, but you know that working in his style, you will not win the Prix de Rome because they're all Calatrava people. So which one do you pick? Do you pick the one you believe in, or do you pick the one that's going to get you ahead in the world? So it's a little problem that you're facing. Now, after you've passed a sufficient number of projects, you do degree project or Grand Prix de Rome. The winner, the one person wins. You can pass, but there's a winner. That winner gets a year scholarship in Rome or Athens, and they have a villa there that you stay at. And here's the trick. You have to win. Because if you win, you're set for life. Upon winning, when you come home from your scholarship, you are appointed the chief architect of a monumental building, Notre Dame, something like that. And you get to go to state dinners and you wear a big medal. If you don't win, you don't get that stuff. Now, what to make it worse is the École des Beaux-Arts is free for anybody under 30, men or women from anywhere in the world. If you don't win, you can enter again next year and next year. So as a first-timer, you're competing against people that have done it 3 or 4 times. So it's really rough competition. Many of the major American architects of the day went to the École des Beaux-Arts because there weren't any schools in the U.S., or hardly any. And it was a great school, and it was free. And what would happen is you'd be working in a major office, and if you were spotted as a hotshot, they would sponsor you to go there. They would pay your expenses to go. We didn't have government grants and loans and fellowships, and so more successful people were responsible for doing that. So the more successful architects get sponsored. So, for example, Frank Lloyd Wright showed up as a real hotshot architect in Chicago, and Daniel Burnham, who was a really big political architect in Chicago, said, Frank, I'll pay for you to go to the École des Beaux-Arts for a year. When you come back, you'll be an associate in the firm. And Wright said, no thanks, Louis Sullivan already ruined me. I'm going to do the modern architecture stuff. I'm not doing that stuff. But that's how you'd get sponsored. The Americans didn't hang around for the Grand Prix de Rome. They wanted to come back and start doing railroad stations and light. America was booming. There was plenty of work. So they wanted to come back and start building buildings. This is the main hall, and these are plaster. This is Venus de Milo. These are plaster casts of famous sculptures. This is a Temple of Apollo. There's a hole in the ground here to let it go lower so it'll fit full scale. And you sit here with a sketch pad in your lap drawing these things. The sculpture students in particular, or the drawing students, would be copying the sculptures. And by having the architects, sculptors, and painters were all going to work together. because sculpture typically meant the lions in front of the 42nd Street Library. In other words, you're going to be making sculptures for buildings. You're going to be doing murals in buildings. So the architects, painters, and sculptors were going to be working together later in their career, and they're educated together. This is kind of work you do. This is a guy named Duran, who did a textbook of basic forms. And here is a student rendering. There are 3 of these of Tuscan, Ionic, and Corinthian, the 3 levels of the Colosseum. This looks so photorealistic because the shades and shadows are projected. In other words, he doesn't guess, or they don't guess, but rather construct how the shadows are going to fall, which is what makes this look very realistic. Anybody use shades and shadows in your software? You know, you can position the sun and then it illuminates your building. So they had to be able to do that on paper. These are 2 Prix de Rome winners, and we see a very strong differential. This one's earlier, and it's quite ornate, elaborate, filled with stairs. It's a palace for a monarch, filled with staircases. But we see here something called poche. So we look at these dark, thick walls, and look at how the thickness of the wall molds the shape of these spaces. So it's a very rich interplay of solid and void. This is another Prix de Rome winner later, and this is, not remembering who it is, but very modern and so strongly and clearly done that it won, even though it was not ornate. Upon winning, the first thing you had to do was paint a self-portrait. Of course, you could paint, sculpt, and don't worry. You could paint, sculpt, and do architecture, as they called a Beaux-Arts student. So you paint a self-portrait. They're all up on the wall in the top floor, all these self-portraits from the winner from every year. You then go, he went to Athens, and you then make a set of drawings. You pick a building, and he's picked the Parthenon. You make 2 sets of drawings. One is the way it is today, or his day, and 2 is the way it originally was, restored, which you could do because archaeology is part of your education. And here's his restoration section and detail. These, we don't have the color, but here we see them in color. And we know that the Parthenon was polychrome, multicolored. We don't know the exact colors, but this is his assumptions about the colors. The most famous building in France coming out of this tradition is Charles Garnier's The Opera. It's now called the Garnier Opera. And it's based on the Baroque of the east front of the Louvre, and quite richly ornate, but also highly functional, very well worked out. This is the public's arrival. This is the monarch's arrival. But it's for, the Paris Opera was for the emerging new middle class, the new from industrialization and commercialization as a new wealthy class. This is their opera house. And here we see a portico and then a foyer and then the main lobby and then the great stair and then the circulations. And finally, this is the seating. The seating's a tiny part of the whole thing. Here's the stage. Here's the backstage with all these flies that they can drop scenery down and lift scenery up. How many people saw the movie Phantom of the Opera? So if you want to kill somebody, you drop a sandbag from up there. So Phantom of the Opera, the building is supposed to be based on this, but that building is much more local and modest. This is pretty grand. That building was not quite as grand as this. Here's the grand staircase. How do men show off their wealth? Not with their clothes. Everybody wears the same tuxedo, right? You do it with your arm candy. So you have a woman who's got a Cartier dress and, $100 million worth of diamonds and So that's where you show off your wealth. And your woman's clothes and jewelry, and then you walk up and down the stairs to make sure everybody sees you. So the point of the stairs is for everybody to show off. It's like who cares who wins the Oscars? You want to see all the clothes, right? So you want to see the red carpet at the beginning of the Oscars where they come in and they say, when they interview the actress, what's the first thing they ask? Who are you wearing? Right. I don't know who the current designers are, but it'll be some current design. Although this year they're all supposed to wear black because they're protesting sexual abuse. But this is the equivalent of the red carpet for all the wealthy people to show off. Now, this comes to the United States. And there's something I'm really not talking about here. There's a limit to how much background we can go into. But starting in the 1870s, we get the Chicago School. And that's a series of skyscrapers to go up in Chicago, most famous architect being who? Who's the most famous Chicago School architect doing skyscrapers? Louis Sullivan, for whom Frank Lloyd Wright worked. So Chicago is launching modern architecture. The skyscrapers of the Chicago School. 1893, in the middle of all this, comes, I don't know why it's 1893, but the 400th anniversary of Columbus coming to the New World. Should have been 1892. I guess it took them a year to get it together. And so it's the World's Columbian Exposition, or Chicago World's Fair. The chief architect, political architect, masterminding the whole thing was Daniel Burnham, who's into this Beaux-Arts stuff. And he chooses the New York architects to do the key buildings. And they decide it's going to be in the Beaux-Arts style. Architecture in the United States was not looking like this. This introduced it. Before, it looked like the building we're in. Red brick, Pratt campus, the police station just down the block. This kind of red brick, Romanesque stuff is what they were doing in America. And they were nervous about this stuff. Is this American? Is this kind of imperial Rome? We don't have an emperor. Should we be doing this stuff? One of the first examples is the center wing, the center entrance to the Metropolitan Museum. That's by Hunt, and Hunt was the honored architect here. So it took a while for this to be accepted, but it was, and it became, it took off. So the Chicago architects have been trying to do something new, and suddenly this comes plop down in the middle of their city. 750,000 people came to opening day, and they only had one question. Why doesn't my city look like that? And they went home and they built it. So New York, start uptown. The old NYU Uptown campus, now Bronx Community College. Come down Columbia University, the Low Library with the dome. Come further down, the Metropolitan Museum. Then you get Grand Army Plaza. Then you get the 42nd Street Library, 42nd Street Central Station, the old Penn Station that got torn down. The Washington Square Arch, Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Museum. They're all built within a couple of years of this, all in this style, Beaux-Arts style. A lot of things happened here. It's really America announces its coming of age. It had all electric lights to light up at night. No one had ever seen anything like that before. So the introduction of electricity, all these new technologies are being shown off. There's the women's building, and so women are announcing they're coming into the culture in a big way. Women writers, they have major women's conferences, writers, artists, other major figures. And both technologically and culturally, America announces a coming of age onto the world stage with this World's Fair. This is Hunt's administration building. Now, it spreads. And here it is, one of the great tragedies. One of the great tragedies in American architecture is the tearing down of Penn Station. So, McKinley and White, who were sort of the lead architects of the day, built in 1910, torn down in 1963. So here is Penn Station. It's 2 city blocks from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue, from 33rd to 32nd to 31st. This is the post office building, built at the same time. This is Madison Square Garden, is right here. It was torn down for an office building on Madison Square. The tracks are still there underneath. They now want to try to convert the post office to be a poor substitute for what this was, and they're working on that. And it's modeled after a Roman bath. So when I lived on Long Island and worked in New York as a kid, this is what commuters went through. Everybody's treated like a king. If you're commuting in a subway or a train, this is what you should have. You know, not some dark tunnel. And this is what they gave us. The entrance is here. You come in here, the waiting room. Then you go back, and then there's all the down to the tracks. And that room is this. There's a Crystal Palace, iron and glass. And then here are the stairs down to all the tracks. Here's the drawing of the Baths of Caracalla. Here is Penn Station. So it's this part of the Baths of Caracalla they're reproducing. Now it's a steel building. So here it is going up, and then these columns. This vaulting. In Rome, this was concrete. This is poured in place concrete vault. And then if it was a very expensive building, they would put bronze coffers in here. And if not, they would be left bare concrete. We're reproducing that, but it's not. It's a steel building. This is plaster that's hung from the steel. So it's all, I'll use a value word, fake. So the modern architects really picked on this. They said, this is all phony. This is, it looks like it is a stage set. It's like a Western set in a movie. They prop up the saloon, but it's just a piece of cardboard with struts in back of it. Here's one of these columns, and when they tear it down, there's steel in there. They're hollow. They're steel columns. Okay, the one we still have was not torn down. It's Grand Central Station, just a couple of years later. And it's sort of a Roman bath. Definitely Roman style by way of French and other styles. Might say Beaux art is Roman architecture by way of Greece. Roman architecture built on Greece and evolved through the Renaissance and Baroque. And just to make a point, these people were not just making phony, cardboard, fake Roman baths. This is a totally modern building. This is Grand Central Station. It has a road running through it. It's got 2 subways and a railroad. 11 skyscrapers are sitting on top of it. So this is a real major megastructural hub. So they get built all over. Here is the New York Public Library. Now, there are 5 parts to one of these buildings. An entrance, a grand foyer, grand stair, galleries for circulation and large, medium, and small spaces. I'm going to go over that in a couple weeks because we're going to see how Kahn's educated in this tradition. He's going to keep this, but he's going to express it in a modern vocabulary. So here are the lines in front. That's what our artists are doing. Very handsome proportioning. Now, I like to argue that Rockefeller Center is totally in this tradition. You just look at the plan. That's a Beaux-Arts plan done by Beaux-Arts architects. And they just left the ornament off. But Beaux-Arts is not just Roman columns. It's a way of organizing the building. And we'll talk about that when we get to where we start seeing Kahn bring it back in his buildings. So Rockefeller Center, I argue, and all the key architects of Rockefeller Center had studied it. They called it Beaux-Arts. It was originally supposed to have a whole upper level of gardens, and you could walk on these bridges from one set of gardens. You know, there was a whole other world, and the budget got cut back, and they never built that part. Okay, United States. So this gets adopted in the 1930s, 20s and 30s. NYU, MIT, University of Pennsylvania were all Beaux-Arts schools. Pratt didn't exist then. Pratt started, and Korean started in the 1950s. NYU shut down during the Depression in the 30s because they said, we can't keep churning out architects when there are no jobs during the Depression. So, but NYU is one of the great architecture schools. What happened was all the students at these schools, if they wished to, would submit their drawings to a competition at the Beaux-Arts Institute in New York. It's now called the Van Allen Institute. And the jury wouldn't know who you are, who your school was. You're just identified by a number. And Penn in the 1920s, when Kahn was there, was the best school, which you can say objectively because it won more medals than anyone else. Because it had a great teacher, Paul Philippe Cray. This is a typical student drawing. This is a memorial in Washington, D.C. for Charles Lindbergh. So this is section, plan, elevation, all in one integrated, beautiful drawing. This is the way. This is typical student work. Okay, 1924, Kahn graduates, and he's doing some of this and some of that. 1932, the Shakespeare Folger Library is being built. So the Folgers, husband and wife, rich, and they built the greatest collection of Shakespeare folios, original manuscripts, stuff about Shakespeare, and built a library in Washington, D.C. to house all this. So if you're in Washington and you want this on your list of buildings to see, if you're an architect, this is an inside building for architects. It's not like, you know, the Capitol or something you would definitely see. But Paul Philippe Cray, who was the chief critic, great French Beaux-Arts teacher at the University of Pennsylvania, Kahn's teacher, his office did it, and Kahn was the chief draftsman on this project. Now, this is something called strip classicism. So what Cray is doing is, these are large areas of just plain white. And these pilasters have no base, no capital. They're just abstract. Well, they have bumps in them, but they're just abstract forms. So they're trying to respond to modern architecture. This is 30 years after Frank Lloyd Wright's first Prairie-style building. This is 4 years before Falling Water. There's modern architect. This is 1929 is the Barcelona Pavilion. 1931 is the Villa Savoye. So that stuff's going on. And these guys are trying to respond. People don't buy it, and it's over. Nobody's doing Beaux-Arts anymore. There was one laggard, the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Was finished in 1941. Now, that's the year I was born. My parents were there in the New Deal, and my parents were, you know, radical young intellectuals, and they and all their friends were like, what is this? You know, we're in the middle of modernism. This is 1941, and they're building a Roman building. So, but this gets swept aside by modern architecture. So, that's the background that Kahn came from. And the question then becomes, how is he going to engage the modern world? We'll take a break before I go on. But, you know, my guess is the words Frank Lloyd Wright were never mentioned at Penn when he was there. One of his classmates, now I interviewed everybody in the Philadelphia school, and I wrote a book about it. It's not published, but it's on my website if you want to look it up. And I have all the tapes. But there was one guy who I didn't interview, and he was a classmate of Kahn's. And I could have found out what was school like for Kahn, you know, because Kahn had died some years earlier. This guy lived into his 90s. But what was it like? And so this guy was the first American to go to Paris and work for Corbeau. Trying to think of his name. He came back with all these Corbeau books, and Kahn poured through them, and he said of the 1930s, I lived in a city called Corbeau. He's just, oh my God, you know, well, they didn't tell me about this in school, you know, all this new stuff. So all these architects in the 1920s, 10s, 20s, and 30s who are educated in this Beaux-Arts tradition then are confronted with modernism. What are they going to do? So we'll talk about that. Let's take a 15-minute break and be back at 3:15.